Okay, 21st century. I'm going to talk about the 20th century and some distant century in the past too. I'm going to talk about sex a lot. I'm going to talk about the Vimalakirti Sutra, which was our study text this past Ango period. And the reason that leads me to talk about sex is part of the story of this talk. Oh good, Roshi's not laughing yet. Enkyo Roshi, that one. I mean, she is laughing. Okay. So the Vimalakirti Sutra, I see there's lots of new people here, so I'm going to do a lot of backing up. It's an ancient Buddhist sutra. As Shinryu Roshi talked to us at a retreat a couple of weeks ago, it's one of the defining texts that moves Buddhism from the Theravadan tradition, where the primary impulse was, I want to be enlightened and get past all this, to the Mahayana tradition, which is, sure, but first we got to take everyone with us. And the Theravadan tradition was very focused on the monasteries, where you would go and remove yourself from society and you would focus on your practice. The Mahayana tradition was focused on everybody. So the going to a monastery to remove yourself for your practice kind of didn't fit that new model. And Vimalakirti is in the tradition seen as someone almost or perhaps even equivalent to the Buddha, but a lay practitioner, the absolute model of Buddhist lay practice. And he was as enlightened or close to as the Buddha himself was, but he practiced this and unfurled his knowledge with expedient means, skillful means. Many of you have heard this term come up to describe Buddhist action in the world. He was a master of expedient means. And the second chapter, where he's introduced as a character in the sutra, it describes how he can go anywhere and know how to teach and convey the teachings of Buddhist practice and bring people to awakening, meeting them wherever they are. And so this was the study text for this last practice period. But the first time I encountered the text was the practice period when I was the head student, the Shuso. And at the time, I remember receiving it and reading it, and the first thought I had was that Enkyo Roshi saw me as this lay student, which is exactly what I am. I have no interest in ordination, can't imagine it. I want to be out in the world doing this practice, and I saw this as a model text for me. Eventually, when I started studying the text more, and eventually later on giving Dharma talks about it, it's an extraordinary text. There's all sorts of varied things in it. One of them is this question of how does a bodhisattva view living beings? And I spoke about this not infrequently because it accords with stuff I think about in terms of complexity theory and how the universe, as a scientist, how the universe is put together, and it sort of reflects through my Buddhist practice. And Manjushri, one of the great bodhisattvas, that bodhisattva on our altar, says to Vimalakirti, how should a bodhisattva regard all living beings? And Vimalakirti replies, Manjushri, a bodhisattva should regard all living beings as a wise man regards the reflection of the moon in water, as being like a face in a mirror, like the water of a mirage, like the sound of an echo, like a mass of clouds in the sky, like a flash of lightning, like the tracks of a bird in the sky. So there's this beautiful way of approaching life and how you see the world, etc. So I would often talk about that. But the thing that, when I first opened the book and read it, that struck me more than anything else, and I haven't talked about till now, is that it talks about all the places in the city that he goes to teach how he brings awakening to beings. And it talks about him standing at the crossroads of the streets in his city. It talks about going into the places of business and the banks. It talks about going into places where people are drinking, where people are gambling. And he goes into the brothels. And I'm a gay man in New York City. I came of age here during the AIDS era, and I've got a Buddhist text that's going to be talking about brothels? That really got my attention. Dogen doesn't talk about brothels, but Dogen was a monastic. But Vimalakirti is going into the brothels. Now, if you actually read the text, he sort of sounds like a, 1920s Puritan anti-drinking person who goes in with an axe and smashes bottles, so we'll ignore that. I'm going more for the Bodhisattva idea of meeting things, meeting people where they are. And for me at the time, this was 2010 when I was Juso, my sex life was a very important part of my life. It still is a very important part of my life. I suspect it's an important part of everybody's life. At least in the mind, if not in fact. How much time do we spend thinking about it? Now, I wasn't always I was always thinking about it. But I wasn't always able to do something about it because I grew up as a kid with my own sets of issues, and I really couldn't cope with being gay. And lots of self-loathing, lots of internalized homophobia, lots of suicidal ideation. I made it through college by distracting myself by being extremely busy and thought I was really happy with all that busyness, but that was all distraction. I went to medical school. Some of you know this story. I went to medical school not because I wanted to go, heal people, but because freshman year of college, I was thinking, oh, I'm gay, I'm never going to get married, I'm never going to have any kids, I'm going to grow old alone and die, and no one will come to my funeral, and literally on a Tuesday. And that day, my mother called me up to tell me that the doctor who she worked for, who was also her OB who delivered my, had died of a heart attack on the golf course. And the next day, Wednesday afternoon, after the funeral, she called me up. I said, how was Dr. Robinson's funeral? And she said, oh my God, all of Hartford came out to his funeral. So that's why I went to medical school. Yeah, not to help people, but I thought if I can become an important part of people's lives, then I won't be alone. That wasn't a good recipe for medical school. So I got depressed, I failed a year. I was up on the railing of the George Washington Bridge, up and down, back and forth. Finally ran, got into therapy, got into analysis, not to become okay with myself, but because I thought, this is the early 80s, that if, that Freudian analysis was the likeliest way to become straight. And I had a really good analyst who didn't disabuse me of that notion, but gave me no guarantees either. And he said, we're here to manifest whatever potentials you have inside you. And I thought, it's not what I wanted to hear, but okay. And 4 years later, I came out to my parents. On the way to come out to them, I stopped at the gay bookstore in New York to get a book for my mom on how to have a gay child, because I knew she would want one. And the bookstore clerk who helped me find the book is still my husband now, 37 years later. And so we were off and running. 5 years later, Mark, my husband, was going off to, first, he saw a thing in the New York Times saying getaway weekends in the country. Zen Mountain Monastery has 3-day beginning weekend instruction things up in the Catskills. And he said, you're always talking about meditating. Why don't you go meditate? So I went to Zen Mountain Monastery, and that's how I became a Zen student. He also noted a couple of years later that they were tearing down the Adonis Theater, which was a major gay movie theater. It was an old old general movie palace on 8th Avenue in the 40s, and now there's a Zeckendorf Towers there. And he saw that they were tearing it down in the newspaper, and he said, look, I know this makes you nervous because I've done nothing. I met him and that was it. You're going to regret not going there. So I'm going to Montreal for the weekend, so you should go to the Adonis. I had to smoke a lot of pot to get myself to walk in the door, and I did, and it was amazing. And then he started to give me assignments, because this is what gay guys did in the 1980s, you know? Now, AIDS was happening, and my first person that I met that I knew had AIDS was a patient of mine in 1983, Richard Thurn. I was still trying to become straight, like year 2 of analysis. Failing medical school was a good cover to get into analysis to become straight, because then my parents would go, well, he's having trouble in medical school, so he'll do that. That's why he's in analysis. It's like, whatever. He knew exactly who I was and was so kind to me. He was very healthy on that first admission. I'm sure he lasted for a little while. I'm sure he didn't last more than a year or 2. I never found out what happened to him, and things are not Googleable back that far. And when Roshi assigned me the Vimalakirti Sutra, and I saw that thing about brothels, I thought, wow, Vimalakirti was going into like the Indian equivalent of the Adonis Theater, the bathhouses, the back rooms, the bars, the clubs. And around that time is when as I said, I went to Zen Mountain Monastery and then met Roshi and started sitting at the Village Zendo here. And one of the founders, one of our most important Dharma ancestors in the Village Zendo, and her Dharma brother, Robert Genjin Savage, his photo is on play over there in the corner. You can Google his name. Genjin, Genjin, is his Buddhist name. And if you Google Robert Genjin Savage, today I discovered there's a little video Roshi took of him speaking at GMHC about his meditation practice. Because she and Genjin did what Vimalakirti did. I knew this would get me at some point. All my Dharma talks get me at some point. They went into the place that was not to be gone into. They went to the most despised, loathed, feared community they could. They went to GMHC and started to teach people how to meditate. And that was a very big model for when the Zendo started, that was very much part of the practice of the Zendo. That was a heart practice for when this place first formed. I knew Genjin from the monastery. I'd seen him from afar. Incredibly charismatic, handsome, sexy. I had a huge crush on him that I didn't know what to do with. I got to have a whole bus ride with him back from the monastery. I remember nothing of what we said, except that he was just incredibly kind and kind of indulgent and gentle with me. And I was just like, you know, sparkling. At the time I was about to become Shuso. A couple of days before I left for that big event, and those of you who don't know, being Shuso is this monumentally scary thing where you become a senior student and you've got to like run the retreat, and you think, and there's no guidebook for how to do it. And it's just this ordeal coming at you, and you're thrilled that you've been picked, and at the same time, how the hell are you going to pull it off? So I was extremely anxious, as I want to be. And when I'm extremely anxious, one of the ways I could handle my anxiety is I don't really drink much, but I could go to a sex club. So a couple of days before going up to become Shuso, I went to a club. And I met this guy, and we had a nice time, as one hopefully does. And then we're talking, because that also usually follows. And he said, so what are you doing for the weekend? I said, well, I'm going up to this Zen retreat. He said, You do that Zen thing? I said, yeah. He goes, I knew a guy who did Zen once. His name was Robert Savage. He was this composer and pianist. And I was like, oh my God. Now, Genjin had passed away at this point in 1993, so long ago. This is 2010. And I knew a lot about Genjin at GMHC, at the monastery, in our Sangha, but I didn't know that side. And I was like, what was he like? And he told me all about how, even in those settings, how kind he was, and compassionate, and caring, and not afraid of intimacy and connection. And I thought to myself, getting Vimalakirti Sutra and thinking about the Bodhisattva in the brothel, how does one behave? How does a Bodhisattva behave in the brothel, or the bars, or the bathhouses, or wherever you're going to find yourself? Like that. So I went off to become Shuso. With that, I felt like, oh, there's this other line of transmission I just got a glimpse of. For that other part of me that doesn't seem to fit in the Zendo. That when I'm wearing my robes and I'm wearing my rakusu and I look in the mirror, that's not what I'm thinking about. But that part of me is in there too. I mentioned this to Roshi at some point, and we talked about the way he would talk about going dancing. And I remember her saying that she imagined the clubs to be just filled with hungry ghosts, that Buddhist notion of beings who just are insatiable, whose needs, desires just can't ever be satisfied. And that's kind of what the experience can be like. But it's also where gay men taught each other how to have safe sex. That stuff was going on all through the AIDS years, and it wasn't because people weren't taking care of each other. The measure of how they were taking care of each other is that HIV transmission rates in the gay community dropped to next to nothing, even as they were climbing in the straight community. Rates of syphilis, rates of chlamydia, rates of gonorrhea throughout the gay community dropped to next to nothing at that time while all of this was going on, because that's where we were taking care of each other. Going out dancing, yeah, you hope you meet someone, it's this very exciting, it's all driven by desire, of course it is. But at the same time, it was this communal practice of dealing with all the grief of all the people who died last week, and the preparation for what was coming next week. So when I read Vimalakirti, it's sort of like, oh, where are the tough places? Where are the unexpected places? Not the usual places where you expect your Buddhist practice to play out, but the unusual places, the places we think generally where they're to be excluded, or we just don't think to include it at all. I remember when I first got interested in mystical practice, eventually at Zen practice, my initial idea was, oh, this is how I would transcend the problems of my body, the problems of being a gay man, the problems of having a sexual urge. Isn't this how we escape all of that? Only to discover, in part through Genjin's example, no, it's through our bodies that we have this practice. Transcendence is about getting past it all. It's about really being intimate with our physical beings as well as our emotional beings and our intellectual beings. It's all of a piece, no piece excluded. Not excluding the bars or the gambling dens or the brothels or the places of business or the hospital. Did that. In no particular order. So that's kind of, when I think of Vimalakirti from 2010, the word brothels is there in front of me. And to me, what it means, who I used to be, and who in part through this practice and through a lot of therapy and analysis and a lot of good partners and friends and family who take care of me and who I take care of in return, it's about, can we face the places that are dark, that are forbidden, that aren't expected, that aren't desired, that are loathed, that we fear. I think about Roshi and Genjin going to GMHC, and if you weren't around during that time, I mean, these were the most despised people in the city, the most feared. And they went in, and they were fearless about it. So what I'd say is, it's our practice, it was Vimalakirti's practice, to practice where we are, and doing it unafraid, even in the places we fear, and doing it without aversions, even when we're confronted by the things we have deep aversions to. Jisei spoke about Vimalakirti over the retreat and talked about being a chaplain. And as I'm a pathologist, I don't go into patients' rooms anymore, but when you go into, but I remember from being a medical student, you stand at the door of a patient in the hospital and you have no idea who that patient's going to be and what they're going to expect from you and what they're going to need from you. And it can be things you're totally prepared to give, and it can be things you're not prepared to give at all. But you have to go in and be prepared. We have a community of Zen practitioners who go into prisons. How much of us keep prison life where we can't see it? And in a culture where we have so many people in prisons, and yet we put them over there and pretend we're not there. But a lot of practitioners in our community are Zen friends to people in prison, places that are terrifying for me to think about. Or being a bodhisattva in a bar or the bathhouse, or a halfway house or a 12-step meeting. If we don't take our practices into those places, what are we doing? What are we here for? And then I think, as I was lying on a couch with my Freudian analyst scribbling silently behind me all those years, and then eventually being on a cushion and facing the wall, with me just being silent or trying to get there, just a hungry ghost trying to become my own bodhisattva. And each of us, every time we look in the mirror, can we be unafraid? Can we drop our aversions to whatever those things are in ourselves that we think don't belong in our practice or can't be addressed in our practice? And go, oh, this is where my practice is. I think that's the practice of Vimalakirti.